The briefing room fell silent when Commander Patricia Voss walked to the podium that morning at Naval Air Station Oshana. What happened in the next 7 minutes would become the subject of investigation, disciplinary hearings, and ultimately, a complete restructuring of how the Navy viewed combat readiness. But none of that mattered to the 37 pilots sitting in those chairs, staring at the woman whose flight jacket bore no squadron patches, no combat ribbons, just a small silver pin nobody recognized. Lieutenant Maya Reeves sat in the back row, arms crossed, watching the way younger pilots exchanged glances. She'd seen this before. The assumption, the dismissal, the certainty that whoever stood at that podium couldn't possibly understand what it meant to pull 7GS in a combat turn or put ordnance on target while surface-to-air missiles painted your aircraft. Maya had been flying FA-18 Super Hornets for 9 years. She'd done 3 carrier deployments, logged over 2,000 flight hours, and earned a reputation as one of the most technically proficient pilots in her squadron. Her call sign was Cypher, because of how she read enemy tactics like encrypted messages, breaking them down into predictable patterns. But sitting in that briefing room, she felt the familiar weight of being invisible. Commander Voss didn't introduce herself with credentials or combat history. She simply dimmed the lights and brought up a photograph on the screen. It showed the wreckage of an aircraft, twisted metal scattered across desert sand, smoke still rising from the impact crater. "This was Captain Michael Torres," Voss said quietly. "Shot down over Syria 4 days ago. He ejected successfully. His wingman reported visual confirmation of a good shoot. But when the combat search and rescue team reached his position 18 hours later, they found his body 300 meters from where he landed." The room shifted. Several pilots leaned forward. Maya felt her jaw tighten. Voss advanced to the next slide. It showed burn marks on a pilot's forearms, uniform sleeves rolled up. "These aren't battle scars," Voss continued. "This is what happens when you train your entire career thinking that survival depends on your aircraft's capability, your weapons systems, your technology. Captain Torres died because nobody taught him that the most dangerous threat begins the moment you touch the ground." She let those words hang in the air. Maya studied the commander's face in the dim light. There was something there, something beyond the clinical presentation. A tightness around the eyes, a deliberate control in the voice. "I'm here to teach you what the enemy already knows," Voss said. "That your billion-dollar fighter jet means nothing when you're alone in hostile territory with nothing but your training and your will to survive. Some of you will think this training is unnecessary. Some of you will resent the time away from your aircraft. But I promise you this. If you're ever shot down, you'll remember every word I say." Maya watched as Voss began outlining a training program unlike anything naval aviation had attempted before. 3 weeks of intensive survival, evasion, resistance, and escape training, specifically designed for modern combat scenarios. Not the standard SEER course pilots went through early in their careers, but something evolved, something built from recent combat losses and captured personnel debriefings. The younger pilots around her whispered among themselves. She heard fragments of their conversation, the skepticism barely concealed. A lieutenant junior grade 2 seats over muttered something about classroom warriors, and several others laughed quietly. Maya didn't join in. She was watching Commander Voss's hands. They were steady on the laser pointer, professional and controlled, but Maya had learned to read people the way she read tactical situations. There was a story behind those steady hands, something that explained why a Navy commander would dedicate herself to teaching pilots how to survive after their aircraft failed them. The briefing continued with statistics Maya found disturbing. In the last decade, the military had lost more pilots to capture and execution after ejection than to actual aircraft losses in combat. The technology had become so advanced, the aircraft so capable, that when pilots did go down, they were fundamentally unprepared for the reality of ground survival. The enemy knew this. They'd adapted their tactics accordingly. "Your aircraft is your weapon," Voss said, advancing through slides showing enemy air defense systems. But the moment you pull the ejection handles, you become the weapon. Everything from that point forward depends on decisions you make in seconds, with incomplete information, under extreme physical and psychological stress. She paused, looking directly at the assembled pilots. Captain Torres made 3 critical errors in the 18 hours between ejection and his death. Each one was preventable. Each one was a direct result of training gaps we're going to fill in the next 3 weeks. Maya noticed several pilots shifting uncomfortably. The reality of mortality was settling into the room like cold fog. These were people who flew aircraft capable of supersonic speeds, who could deliver precision weapons from altitudes the enemy could barely reach. The idea that they might be vulnerable after ejection challenged their fundamental understanding of air superiority. Voss brought up a map showing Tor's ejection point and the route he'd attempted to take toward friendly lines. He moved during daylight, she said simply. He followed a streambed that was completely visible from the air. He didn't establish a hide site. These weren't panic decisions. These were choices made by an exceptionally trained pilot who simply didn't have the ground survival skills to match his aerial combat proficiency. The briefing ended with practical details. Training would begin in 48 hours. All pilots, regardless of rank or experience, would participate. There would be classroom work, but most of it would be field exercises in environments designed to simulate contested territory. Voss would be personally overseeing the program, assisted by a team of specialists Maya didn't recognize from any naval aviation background. As the lights came up and pilots began filing out, Maya remained seated. She watched Voss gathering her materials, noticed the way the commander's shoulders finally relaxed once the room emptied. That's when Maya saw it. A small tattoo on Voss's left wrist, partially visible as her sleeve shifted. Coordinates. Maya had seen similar tattoos before, always on people who'd survived something they needed to remember forever. "Commander," Maya said, standing and approaching the podium. Voss looked up, her expression neutral but evaluating. "Lieutenant Reeves, correct. Call sign Cipher." Maya nodded, mildly surprised Voss knew her name. "I wanted to ask about the field training. What kind of opposition force will we be facing?" It was a professional question, the kind any pilot might ask, but what Maya really wanted to know was written in those coordinates on Voss's wrist. The commander studied her for a moment. "Former special operations personnel," she said. "People who have actually conducted manhunts in hostile territory. We're not interested in making this comfortable or familiar. You need to experience what it feels like when everything you trust is gone and someone is hunting you with the advantage of local knowledge, terrain familiarity, and time." "You've been through it," Maya said quietly. "Not as training." Voss's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "Syria, 7 years ago. My aircraft took AAA fire on a close air support mission. I ejected over territory controlled by enemy forces. Spent 11 days evading capture before a rescue team could extract me." She paused, and Maya could see the calculation behind her eyes, deciding how much to share. "Captain Torres was my wingman on that mission. He stayed on station, provided cover fire that probably saved my life. I couldn't save his." The weight of that statement filled the empty briefing room. Maya understood now why this program existed, why Voss had pushed it through despite what must have been significant institutional resistance. This wasn't about statistics or policy improvements. This was about debt. "The field training," Maya said, returning to her original question. "How realistic are we talking?" Voss began packing her laptop into its case. "Realistic enough that you'll understand what I'm teaching," she said. "Not realistic enough to actually kill you, though some of you might wonder about that distinction." She looked directly at Maya. "I reviewed your file before coming here. 3 deployments, excellent tactical grades, strong weapons employment. Your squadron commander says you're one of the best pilots he's ever worked with." Maya waited for the other shoe to drop. "There was always qualification after praise. But you've never ejected," Voss continued. "You've never had a catastrophic system failure, never experienced that moment when the aircraft stops being your weapon and becomes your coffin. That's good. It means you're skilled and lucky. but it also means you have a gap in understanding that this training is designed to fill. 2 days later, Maya found herself in the back of a cargo truck with 11 other pilots, heading toward a training area she'd never seen on any base map. The sky was overcast, temperature dropping as evening approached. Nobody was talking. The initial skepticism from the briefing room had been replaced by something harder to define, not quite fear, but a recognition that this wouldn't be like other training exercises. The truck stopped in a heavily wooded area. When the tailgate dropped, Maya saw Voss standing with 4 other instructors, all wearing civilian outdoor gear rather than military uniforms. Behind them was what looked like a small village, buildings constructed with deliberate attention to foreign architecture. Smoke rose from several structures. The sound of distant gunfire echoed through the trees. "Welcome to your worst day," Voss said as pilots climbed down from the truck. "In approximately 30 minutes, you will each be inserted at separate locations within this training area. You have no radios, no GPS, no survival gear beyond what's in a standard survival vest. Your objective is to reach the extraction point 12 kilometers north of your insertion without being captured by the opposition force." She gestured toward the tree line, where Maya could now see people moving, some with dogs. "The opposition will be actively hunting you. If captured, you'll be processed through a condensed resistance training sequence. If you successfully evade for 48 hours and reach the extraction point, you pass this phase." A lieutenant commander from another squadron raised his hand. "What are the rules of engagement for the opposition?" Voss smiled slightly. It wasn't a comforting expression. "They're not allowed to cause permanent injury. Everything else is fair game. They'll use the same tactics enemy forces would use: pursuit, ambush, deception, exploitation of your mistakes. Some of you will be caught in the first 6 hours. A few might make it to extraction. Either way, you'll learn." Maya felt her heart rate increasing. This was beyond any training scenario she'd experienced. The Navy didn't typically do this kind of high-stress ground training for aviators. They flew aircraft, delivered ordnance, and trusted that rescue forces would recover them if something went wrong. But Voss was systematically dismantling that comfortable assumption. The instructors began separating pilots into individual groups, each assigned to different insertion points. Maya found herself walking with Voss toward a vehicle that would take her to her starting location. "You're wondering why I pulled your file specifically," Voss said as they walked. It wasn't a question. Maya nodded. "You think like a tactician," Voss continued. "Your squadron commander mentioned it in his evaluation. You don't just execute missions, you understand them at a systems level. You see patterns." She paused as they reached the vehicle. "That's going to help you in this training. But it's also going to work against you, because the patterns you're used to recognizing don't apply the same way on the ground. The tactical advantage shifts entirely." They drove in silence for 20 minutes, deeper into the woods. When the vehicle finally stopped, Maya was alone with Voss and a single driver. The forest around them was dense, the light fading rapidly. "Your insertion point is 200 meters west," Voss said. "The extraction point is marked on this map." She handed Maya a small laminated card showing terrain features and a circled location. 12 kilometers north, but the terrain will force you to cover more ground than that. The opposition knows the general insertion areas but not your specific location. That advantage lasts about an hour, maybe less if you make noise or obvious mistakes. Maya studied the map, already forming a mental picture of the terrain. Water sources, likely enemy positions, concealment versus cover. Her pilot training was kicking in: threat assessment, risk mitigation, objective prioritization. Voss seemed to read her thoughts. "Stop thinking like a pilot," she said quietly. "Aircraft move fast above the engagement. On the ground, everything slows down, every decision has weight, every sound you make travels. The terrain that looks navigable on a map might take hours to cross in darkness." She checked her watch. "You have 60 seconds before we leave and your time starts. Any questions?" Maya had dozens of questions, but she understood this wasn't the moment for them. "No, ma'am." "Good luck, Cypher." Voss's expression was unreadable. "Remember, survival is a series of small decisions made correctly under pressure. Don't try to win, Just try not to lose." The vehicle drove away, leaving Maya alone in the darkening forest. She stood still for a full minute, just listening. Wind through trees, distant bird calls, the faint mechanical sound of something moving far to the east. Her training told her to move immediately, to put distance between herself and the insertion point. But Voss's words echoed and her mind stopped thinking like a pilot. She forced herself to slow down, to actually assess rather than react. The survival vest contained basic items she cataloged by field signal mirror: knife, fire-starting material, water purification tablets, compass, first aid kit. Nothing electronic, nothing that would give her a technological advantage. This was about fundamental skills, the kind of survival that didn't depend on batteries or satellites. Maya began moving west, away from the extraction point initially. It seemed counterintuitive, but she knew pursuit teams would expect movement directly toward the objective. Better to create confusion first, establish a circuitous route that would make tracking more difficult. The terrain was rougher than the map suggested. Fallen logs, thick underbrush, areas where the ground became marsh-like and threatened to leave obvious tracks. She moved slowly, testing each step, using shadows and tree cover. The pilot in her wanted to move faster, to use speed as an advantage. But she was learning a different kind of tactics now. After an hour of careful movement, Maya heard at voices, perhaps 400 meters to her south, speaking English, which meant they were part of the opposition force. They were moving systematically, establishing a search pattern. She crouched behind a fallen tree and listened. The voices faded, moving east. They hadn't found her trail yet, but it was only a matter of time. She pulled out the map, studying it by the last light of dusk. There was a ridgeline 3 kilometers north that would provide good observation, but would also be an obvious route. A creek system to the west offered concealment but might be patrolled. Every choice carried risk. Maya decided on a hybrid approach: move to the creek for the next phase of darkness, use the water to mask her trail, then shift to higher ground before dawn. It would add distance to her journey, but speed was the enemy here. Patience and careful movement would matter more than miles covered. The night deepened. Maya moved through the forest like she'd never moved before, aware of every sound, every shift in air pressure, every change in the quality of darkness. This was flying stripped of everything that made it familiar: no instruments, no speed, no altitude advantage. Just her, the terrain, and people hunting her with purpose. By midnight, Maya had covered perhaps 2 kilometers. Her clothes were soaked with creek water, her hands cut from thorns and rough bark. She'd heard the opposition force twice more, once close enough that she'd lain completely still in the underbrush for 20 minutes while boots passed within meters of her position. The physical discomfort was manageable. She'd been through worse in flight training, during carrier qualifications, when sleep deprivation and constant pressure ground pilots down to their essential determination. But there was something psychologically different about this. In the cockpit, she had agency. She could maneuver, accelerate, employ weapons. Here, her primary tactic was to be invisible, to move without being detected, to make herself nothing. Around 0200, Maya found a depression beneath a fallen tree that offered concealment. She needed rest, even just an hour or two. Pushing through exhaustion would lead to mistakes, and mistakes would lead to capture. She arranged herself in the hide, covering herself with debris and leaves, and allowed her body to relax while her mind stayed partially alert. Sleep came in fragments, awareness surfacing every few minutes at small sounds or shifts in temperature. When gray light began filtering through the canopy, Maya woke fully and assessed her situation. She'd made it through the first night without capture. The extraction point was still 10 kilometers away, the terrain between here and there unknown. She ate one of the energy bars from the survival vest, rationed water, and studied the map again. The ridgeline she'd considered last night was now clearly visible through breaks in the trees. It would offer good observation, but it would also expose her to anyone else using the high ground for surveillance. She decided against it. Better to stay in the densest terrain, move slowly, arrive at extraction later but undetected. As the sun rose higher, Maya began moving again. Daylight changed everything. What had been concealing darkness became exposing clarity. Every movement had to be calculated, every sound minimized. She understood now why Voss had emphasized Captain Tor's mistakes moving during daylight, following obvious terrain features. The temptation to take easier routes was constant, the rational part of her brain arguing for efficiency over caution. But she kept thinking about those coordinates tattooed on Voss's wrist, about 11 days of evasion in hostile territory, about promises made to a wingman who didn't survive his own ejection. This training wasn't theoretical. It was written in someone's survival and someone else's death. Around mid-morning, Maya heard the dogs. The sound came from the east, distant but unmistakable. Barking, organized and purposeful, they'd brought tracking dogs into the exercise. Maya felt her first real spike of fear. She could evade human searchers by being careful and patient. Dogs operated on different principles. They followed scent, and she'd been moving through this forest for 14 hours, leaving trace evidence everywhere. She immediately altered her route, moving toward the creek system she'd avoided earlier. Water would break her scent trail, at least temporarily. The barking grew louder, closer. They were moving faster than she was, probably following her track from the insertion point. Maya reached the creek and waded into the cold water. It was deeper than she'd expected, nearly to her waist in places. She moved upstream, feet finding purchase on slippery rocks, branches slapping at her face. The water was painfully cold, but it was her best option. After 30 minutes of wading, Maya climbed out on the opposite bank and immediately moved into thick underbrush. She could still hear the dogs, but the sound was more distant now, confused. The water had worked, but she knew they'd pick up the trail again eventually. The handlers would cast wider, find where she'd exited the creek. She'd bought time, nothing more. The rest of the day became an exercise in sustained evasion. Maya moved in short bursts, covering perhaps 100 meters, then stopping to listen and observe. She doubled back on her own trail twice, creating false paths that would waste pursuit time. She used every technique she could remember from survival training, plus improvised methods that came from her tactical understanding of pursuit dynamics. By late afternoon, she'd covered maybe 4 more kilometers. The extraction point was 6 kilometers away, but between her and that objective was increasingly open terrain. The forest was thinning, giving way to what looked like cleared areas and possibly roads. Moving through open ground in daylight was suicide from a tactical perspective. She'd have to wait for nightfall again. Maya found another hide site, this one in a rocky outcropping that offered better protection and observation. She settled in to wait, watching the sun track across the sky with the patience of someone who understood that survival wasn't about heroic action, but about not making fatal mistakes. As darkness fell on the second night, she heard voices again. Closer this time, systematic. They were tightening the search pattern, knowing that pilots would be approaching extraction points now. The psychological pressure was becoming a factor. Pilots would start taking risks, pushing for the objective even when tactical patience suggested waiting. Maya forced herself to remain still for another hour after full darkness. Only then did she begin moving toward the extraction point. The final 6 kilometers took 8 hours. Maya moved through darkness with extreme caution, aware that opposition forces would be concentrated near the extraction point. This was where most captures would happen, pilots desperate to complete the objective, willing to take risks they'd avoided earlier. Twice she detected ambush positions, people waiting in concealment along likely approach routes. She circled wide around them, adding time and distance but maintaining freedom of movement. The terrain became her enemy now. Open areas forced long detours. A road required 30 minutes of observation before she dared cross it, timing her movement between patrol vehicles. Every kilometer felt like 10, every hour stretched by hyper-awareness and the constant calculation of risk versus progress. At 0430, Maya reached a position overlooking the extraction point. It was marked by a small clearing with what looked like a landing zone designation. She could see 3 other pilots already there, sitting under guard, captured in the final approach. Two opposition force members were visible, but Maya's tactical training suggested there would be more in concealment. She studied the area for 45 minutes, identifying patrol patterns and likely hide positions. Then she began a slow, circular approach, staying in the deepest terrain, moving only when she was certain of her route. The last 200 meters took an hour. Maya crawled through underbrush, her body screaming in protest, every muscle strained from 40 hours of continuous evasion. She could see the extraction point clearly now, could see the captured pilots and their guards, could even see Commander Voss standing at the edge of the clearing with her evaluation tablet. 50 meters from the clearing, Maya heard movement behind her. She froze, completely still. Footsteps, two people, moving through the forest in a search pattern. They were close, maybe 20 meters away. If she moved, they'd hear her. If she stayed still, they might walk right past or they might stumble directly onto her position. She chose stillness. The footsteps came closer. Maya could hear breathing now, the rustle of equipment. They were talking quietly to each other, discussing search sectors and time remaining. 15 meters. 10. She could see them now through the undergrowth. Two opposition force members, both carrying training weapons, both scanning the forest systematically. 5 meters. One of them stopped, looking directly at her position. Maya didn't breathe, didn't move, became part of the terrain. The person stepped closer, weapon raised. "I've got something here," he called to his partner. Maya's mind raced through options. She could break cover and run for the extraction point, only 50 meters, but she'd be caught before reaching it. She could remain still and hope they didn't find her, but that hope was fading rapidly. Or she could do what Voss had taught in the briefing, make the decision that gave her the best chance, even if it wasn't the comfortable one. Maya remained absolutely still as the opposition force member approached her position. She could see his boots now, less than 2 meters away. He was sweeping the area with his weapon, methodical and professional. Her muscles screamed from the tension of complete immobility, but she knew movement would trigger his peripheral vision instantly. The second member of the patrol joined the first. "What do you see?" "Thought I saw something move. Probably an animal." They stood there for 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes. Maya could smell their equipment, could hear the fabric of their clothing rustling with each movement. One of them keyed a radio. "Sector 7 clear, moving to Sector 8. They walked away, disappearing into the forest. Maya waited 10 full minutes before allowing herself to breathe normally. Her hands were shaking slightly, not from fear but from the adrenaline dump of near capture. She'd been invisible when visibility seemed impossible. That small victory carried weight beyond the immediate situation. The sky was beginning to lighten. Dawn would make the final approach even more dangerous. Maya resumed her crawl toward the extraction point, moving with extreme patience through the last 50 meters of terrain. She could see Voss now, watching the tree line with the expression of someone who'd been exactly where Maya was, who understood the calculations being made in real time. At 06:15, 43 hours after insertion, Maya low-crawled into the extraction clearing from an unexpected direction. She stood slowly, hands visible, and walked toward Voss. The commander's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes that might have been approval. "Lieutenant Reeves," Voss said formally, "you are the third pilot to reach extraction through evasion. 7 have been captured. The others are still out there." She checked her tablet. 43 hours, estimated 12.7 kilometers covered based on your approach vector. No captures, no significant trail evidence detected by opposition force until your final approach when you evaded direct contact. Voss lowered the tablet. "How did you avoid the patrol at the end?" "Stayed still," Maya said simply. "They were looking for movement, not presence. Once they decided I was an animal or shadow, their cognitive bias did the rest. And if they decided differently, then I'd be sitting with the others," Maya acknowledged. "The tactic wasn't perfect. It was just the best option available at that moment." Voss nodded slowly. "You're beginning to understand," she said. "Air combat is about technological superiority and speed. Ground survival is about patience and accepting imperfect choices. Come on, let's get you processed and fed. Then we'll debrief what you learned." The next 2 weeks of training built on that foundation. Voss pushed the pilots through scenarios that progressively removed more advantages and added more complications. Evasion with injuries, resistance to interrogation, survival in extreme weather, building improvised shelters, finding food and water in barren terrain. Each exercise was designed to strip away the comfortable assumptions that came with being a pilot, that technology would save you, that rescue was guaranteed, that your training made you invulnerable. Maya discovered she was better at some aspects than others. Her tactical mind helped with evasion planning and threat assessment. She struggled with the physical demands of prolonged survival without proper nutrition. The resistance training, even though it was controlled and monitored, pushed her to psychological limits she hadn't known existed. But through it all, she watched Voss and began to understand something deeper about why this training existed. It wasn't just about giving pilots skills they might need if shot down. It was about changing their fundamental relationship with vulnerability. Pilots were trained to be confident, aggressive, decisive. Those traits worked in the cockpit. They could be fatal on the ground. On the 15th day of training, Voss conducted a classroom session that felt different from the others. The pilots who'd completed the field training sat quietly, no longer exchanging skeptical glances or dismissive comments. They'd all experienced some version of what Maya had gone through: the fear, the exhaustion, the moment when everything familiar stopped working and survival became a series of impossible choices. "You've completed the practical phase," Voss began. "Now I want to talk about why this matters beyond the immediate skills." She brought up a photograph on the screen. It showed a pilot in flight gear, smiling at the camera. "Captain Torres again. Some of you are tired of hearing about him. But his death is the reason you're all here, so we're going to talk about it one more time." Voss advanced to the next slide, showing a timeline. Torres ejected at 14:30 local time. His position was reported immediately by his wingman. A combat search and rescue mission was authorized within 20 minutes. The rescue team launched 90 minutes later. She paused. But they couldn't go directly to his position. Enemy air defense systems required suppression. Weather deteriorated. Political considerations about operating in Syrian airspace delayed authorization. By the time the rescue team was cleared to enter the area, it was the next morning, 18 hours after ejection. Another slide appeared, showing terrain features. Torres landed in a region with minimal vegetation, rocky terrain, limited water sources. He had standard survival gear, but, based on evidence recovered at the scene, made several critical errors. He moved during daylight. He followed a dry stream bed that was visible from the air. He didn't establish adequate concealment. Voss's voice remained steady, but Maya could see the tension in her shoulders. This wasn't academic for the commander. This was personal history being dissected for educational purposes. Enemy forces found him approximately 8 hours after ejection. There's evidence he evaded initially. We found 3 separate positions where he'd stopped and attempted to hide. But his movement pattern was predictable. He was thinking like a pilot, trying to cover ground quickly toward friendly lines, not like someone who needed to disappear. The next image was harder to look at. Satellite footage showing heat signatures moving through terrain, converging on a single point. This was taken by ISR assets approximately 10 hours after ejection. You can see Torres here. Voss indicated a single heat signature, and enemy forces here, here, and here. He's moving toward what he thinks is an escape route. They're herding him into a kill zone. She let that image remain on screen for a long moment. Torres was captured. Based on equipment recovered later, he was alive at that point. We don't know exactly what happened in the next 8 hours. What we do know is that when the rescue team reached his last known position, they found his body, shot multiple times at close range, left as a message. The room was completely silent. These were combat pilots, people who'd faced danger in the air, but there was something particularly brutal about the image Voss was painting. A fellow pilot alone on the ground, hunted, captured, executed. "I'm not showing you this to be cruel," Voss said quietly. "I'm showing you this because it's real. It happened to someone who was trained exactly like you were trained. Someone who was technically proficient, physically fit, professionally competent." someone who simply didn't have the specific skills needed to survive on the ground in hostile territory. She closed the presentation and turned to face the assembled pilots directly. Every exercise you've completed in the last 2 weeks was built from Tor's experience and my own. The evasion tactics we taught you, those came from analyzing what worked during my 11 days on the ground and what didn't work during his 18 hours. The resistance training came from debriefs with recovered personnel who survived capture. The survival techniques came from people who have actually had to implement them when everything else failed. Maya raised her hand. Voss nodded toward her. Ma'am, you mentioned the rescue team was delayed by multiple factors. Even with perfect ground survival skills, Tors was operating against a clock he couldn't control. How do we account for that? It was a fair question, one several other pilots were clearly thinking about based on their expressions. Voss walked to the window, looking out at the flight line where FA-18 sat ready for launch. You can't control the rescue timeline, she said. You can't control enemy search patterns or weather or political authorization delays. The only thing you can control is whether you're still alive and free when rescue becomes possible. She turned back to face them. Tors needed to survive for 18 hours. If he'd had the skills we've been teaching you, if he'd gone to ground immediately, established proper concealment, stayed still instead of moving, he would have been alive when that rescue team arrived. His death wasn't inevitable. It was the result of training gaps that we, as an institution, failed to address. The weight of institutional failure hung in the air. This wasn't about individual fault. This was about systemic problems in how naval aviation prepared its people for worst-case scenarios. There's something else I need you to understand, Voss continued. The enemy knows our rescue procedures. They know our timelines, our capabilities, our authorization processes. They've adapted their tactics specifically to exploit the gap between when a pilot goes down and when rescue can be executed. They're not just trying to kill you in the air. They're trying to capture you on the ground because they understand that a captured or killed pilot has strategic value beyond the lost aircraft. She pulled up another slide, this one showing multiple incidents over the last decade. These are every NATO pilot ejection in contested territory since 2015, 12 total. 7 were successfully recovered, 5 were not. Of those 5, 3 were captured and later released through diplomatic channels. 2, including Tors, were killed. The numbers were stark, better than 50-50 odds but not by much. And that was for people flying the most advanced aircraft in the world, backed by the most sophisticated rescue capabilities ever developed. The trend is getting worse, Voss said. Enemy air defense systems are more capable, which means more pilots are ejecting over hostile territory. Enemy ground tactics are more sophisticated, which means capture rates are increasing. And the political complexity of conducting rescue operations in sovereign airspace is growing, which means rescue timelines are extending. She paused, letting that sink in. We can't fix all those problems in a 3-week training course, but we can fix the one variable that's entirely under your control, your ability to survive and evade until rescue becomes possible. That's what this has been about. Not making you invincible, but closing the gap that cost Tors his life. The briefing ended, but Maya remained seated as other pilots filed out. She was thinking about something Voss had said during the field training, that survival was about making small decisions correctly under pressure. Not winning, just not losing. It was a fundamentally different mindset from everything else in military aviation, where victory and dominance were the measures of success. Voss noticed her sitting alone and approached. Something on your mind, Lieutenant? Maya looked up. The coordinates on your wrist, where do they point to? For a moment she thought Voss wouldn't answer. The commander's expression was unreadable, the professional mask firmly in place. Then something shifted. 37 degrees north, 40.2 degrees east, Voss said quietly. Roughly 90 kilometers west of Aleppo. That's where I was when the rescue team finally extracted me on the 11th day. She sat down across from Maya. I was the pilot equivalent of you, technically proficient, tactically sound, confident in my abilities. When I ejected, I genuinely believed rescue would come within hours. I had training, equipment, the backing of the most powerful military in the world. I thought survival would be straightforward. What changed your mind? Maya asked. The first night, Voss said simply. I landed in an olive grove, broke my ankle on impact, heard enemy vehicles approaching within 30 minutes. Suddenly all my confidence, all my training, all my assumptions about how things would work, none of it mattered. I was alone, injured, and being hunted by people who knew the terrain better than I ever would. She looked down at the coordinates on her wrist. I made every mistake you can make in the first 24 hours. I moved when I should have stayed hidden. I tried to cover ground toward friendly lines instead of going to ground and waiting. I depleted my water supply because I panicked about dehydration. If the enemy had been slightly more competent, or if I'd been slightly less lucky, I would have been captured on the second day. But you survived 11 days, Maya pointed out. Eventually, I stopped trying to be a pilot and started being a survivor, Voss said. I accepted that rescue might not come. I accepted that I might die there. Once I accepted those things, I could actually focus on the moment-to-moment decisions that would keep me alive. I found a cave system, stayed hidden, rationed my supplies, and waited. She met Maya's eyes directly. Tors was my wingman on that mission. He stayed on station, provided cover fire, probably kept me from being captured in those first hours. When I was finally rescued, I promised myself I'd make sure other pilots had the training I didn't have. That's why these coordinates matter. They're not about where I was. They're about why I survived and why I owe that survival to someone who didn't get the same chance later. The training program concluded with a final exercise that combined everything the pilots had learned. A mass casualty scenario, multiple aircraft down in hostile territory, rescue forces overwhelmed, pilots forced to survive independently for an extended period. Maya was inserted with 2 other pilots, none of them from her squadron. The objective was to evade for 72 hours while opposition forces actively hunted them. No communication between pilot teams, no pre-coordinated plans, just individual survival and evasion. The scenario was brutal. Maya spent the first day separated from everyone, moving through mountainous terrain that punished every mistake. She rationed water carefully, avoided obvious routes, and established hide sites that balanced concealment with observation. On the second day, she encountered another pilot, a lieutenant commander named Rodriguez who'd been captured in the first field exercise. He'd learned from that failure. Together, they coordinated movement, covered each other's rest periods, and made it through the second night without being detected. But the third day brought complications. Rodriguez developed symptoms of dehydration and heat exhaustion. Moving him became dangerous, but leaving him wasn't an option from a moral standpoint, even though tactically it would have improved Maya's chances. They found a cave system similar to what Voss had described from her own evasion. Maya established Rodriguez in concealment, used her survival vest supplies to treat his symptoms, and then made the decision that she knew Voss would later evaluate carefully. She stayed with him instead of continuing toward the extraction point. "You should go," Rodriguez said, his voice hoarse. "No tactical reason for both of us to get caught because I screwed up my water discipline. There's also no tactical reason for me to leave a fellow pilot alone when he's injured," Maya countered. "We wait. Rescue will come or it won't. Either way, we're better off together." They waited through the third night. Opposition forces passed their position twice, close enough that Maya could have reached out and touched their boots. But the cave provided concealment, and she'd done enough to mask their trail. When dawn came on the fourth day, Voss walked into their cave with an expression that was equal parts exasperation and approval. "Exercise concluded," she said, looking between Maya and Rodriguez. "You had a clear shot at extraction, Lieutenant Reeves. You chose to stay with an injured pilot instead. Explain your tactical reasoning." Maya helped Rodriguez sit up. "My tactical reasoning is that survival training isn't just about individual evasion. It's about making decisions you can live with after extraction. Leaving him would have haunted me more than getting captured would have." Voss studied her for a long moment. "That's not what I taught you," she said quietly. I specifically covered individual survival priorities over group dynamics. You taught me to make the decision that gave me the best chance of survival, Maya responded. But you also taught me that survival is about more than just staying alive. It's about maintaining the person you are under pressure. I'm not the pilot who leaves people behind. For the first time in 3 weeks, Voss smiled, not the professional acknowledgement she'd shown during exercises, but a genuine expression of recognition. You're right, she said. I did teach you that even if I didn't say it directly. Come on, both of you. Let's get Rodriguez to medical and you to debrief. The final debrief was comprehensive. Voss went through every pilot's performance, identifying strengths and areas for continued development. Some had excelled at evasion but struggled with resistance training. Others had strong survival skills but made tactical errors in route planning. Maya's evaluation highlighted her tactical decision-making and ability to adapt air combat thinking to ground survival, but noted she needed to improve physical endurance for extended evasion. Overall, Voss concluded, addressing the entire group, you've made progress that matters. You're not experts in ground survival. That takes years, not weeks. But you're no longer completely unprepared. You understand the basics of evasion, the principles of concealment, and the mindset needed when your aircraft stops protecting you and becomes your liability. She pulled up one final slide showing Tor's photograph again. I started this training by talking about Captain Tor's death. I want to end by talking about his life. He was an exceptional pilot, a good officer, and someone who deserved better than what happened to him. This training exists because he died. It's successful if it prevents another pilot from dying the same way. The room remained quiet, the weight of 3 weeks of intensive training settling over everyone. These pilots had been pushed beyond comfortable limits, forced to confront vulnerabilities they preferred to ignore, and given skills they hoped never to use. You deploy in 3 months, Voss said. Between now and then, practice these skills. Run through evasion scenarios mentally. View your survival equipment. Think about the decisions you'd make if you found yourself on the ground in hostile territory. This isn't about being paranoid. It's about being prepared for the scenario we all hope never happens. She closed her tablet with finality. Dismissed, and good luck out there. As pilots filed out of the briefing room for the last time, Maya approached Voss one final time. Thank you, she said simply, for teaching us this, for pushing us, for making Tor's death mean something. Voss nodded, the professional mask slipping slightly to reveal genuine emotion. Make sure you come back, Cypher, from every mission. That's how you honor what he taught me and what I've tried to teach you. 3 months later, Maya found herself aboard the USS Harry S. Truman, preparing for deployment to the Mediterranean. Her squadron would be providing air support for operations in Syria, the same region where Voss had ejected 7 years earlier and Tors had died 4 months ago. The training had changed how she viewed every mission brief. Before Voss's program, Maya had focused primarily on tactical execution weapons employment, threat avoidance, communication protocols. Now she found herself also assessing terrain features below the aircraft, identifying potential hide sites, mentally cataloging water sources and evasion routes. Her fellow pilots noticed the change. During mission planning, she asked questions about ground rescue procedures that nobody had considered before. She carried modified survival gear based on what she'd learned during training. She studied maps with a different eye, seeing not just tactical waypoints but potential survival scenarios. On the 5th day of deployment, Maya was flying close air support for ground forces engaged with enemy positions near the Turkish border. The mission was routine until her wingman, call sign Havoc, took a surface-to-air missile that nobody had seen coming. Havoc's hit. Maya called, watching the missile impact tear into the FA-18's left engine. Havoc's status. The response came through strained with emergency procedures. I've got fire warnings, hydraulic failures, losing flight control. I'm going to have to punch out. Maya's heart rate spiked, but her training kicked in. Copy, Havoc. I'm visual on you. Get ready to eject. I'll mark your position and coordinate rescue. She watched Havoc's aircraft tumble through the sky, fire trailing from the damaged engine. At 8,000 feet, the canopy blew and the ejection seat rocketed clear. The parachute deployed, a small white canopy against the hostile terrain below. Maya began executing rescue coordination procedures, but she was also observing Havoc's descent with eyes trained by Voss's program. The winds were pushing him east, toward more populated areas. The terrain below was rocky with minimal vegetation similar to what Tors had faced. She marked the estimated landing point and began calling for rescue assets while maintaining altitude to provide cover. The rescue coordination revealed immediate problems. Combat search and rescue helicopters were 90 minutes out. Enemy forces in the area were already moving, probably having seen the missile impact and ejection. Havoc would be on the ground for at least an hour before rescue could arrive, possibly longer depending on enemy air defense activity. Maya established an orbit over the area, using her aircraft's sensors to track Havoc's position after landing. She saw him hit the ground, watched the parachute collapse, and then observed him moving too fast, too directly toward friendly lines. Havoc, Cypher on guard frequency, Maya transmitted, hopping. He'd switched his survival radio to emergency channels. If you can hear me, you need to go to ground immediately. Stop moving. Find concealment. You've got at least 90 minutes before rescue arrives. Don't try to cover ground. Stay hidden. She couldn't tell if he heard her. The small figure on the ground continued moving, following what looked like a dry riverbed. Maya's training screamed warnings at her. Tors had done the same thing. Moved during daylight, followed obvious terrain features, tried to cover ground instead of disappearing. Enemy vehicles appeared on Maya's sensors, converging from two directions. They'd seen the ejection or been alerted by ground observers. They were moving faster than Havoc could possibly evade on foot. Maya made a decision that would later be reviewed by senior leadership. She broke her orbit and dove toward the enemy vehicles, transmitting in the clear. Cypher engaging enemy ground forces in support of downed pilot. All units be advised, I'm Winchester on precision weapons but will employ gun if necessary. The radio erupted with voices her squadron commander ordering her to maintain altitude, the air controller asking for clarification, the Rescue Coordination Center trying to get her to stand by for proper authorization. Maya ignored them all. She screamed low over the enemy vehicles at 400 knots, breaking the sound barrier directly above them. The sonic boom was her weapon. No ordnance expended, but a clear message that she could deliver violence if they continued toward Havoc's position. The vehicles stopped, probably assessing the threat. Maya pulled up and came around for another pass, this time firing warning shots with her cannon well ahead of their position. She was violating half a dozen rules of engagement, exceeding her authority, and potentially starting a larger engagement. But Havoc was on the ground and enemy forces were hunting him. The calculus seemed simple. For 6 minutes, Maya conducted what could only be called aggressive defensive maneuvering. She made multiple low passes, fired warning shots, and generally made it clear that reaching the downed pilot would require dealing with an extremely motivated FA-18 with cannon rounds remaining. The enemy vehicles eventually withdrew to covered positions, unwilling to expose themselves to air attack. It bought time-precious minutes that Havoc desperately needed. Maya climbed back to altitude, fuel state becoming a concern now. She'd expended energy in those low passes, burned fuel at rates that meant she'd need tanker support before her scheduled recovery time. Cypher, this is Brawler, her squadron commander's voice came through with forced calm. Explain your actions. You've exceeded authorized engagement parameters and potentially compromised the rescue operation. Brawler, Cypher. Enemy forces were moving directly toward Havoc's position with apparent hostile intent. I assessed the threat and employed minimum necessary force to delay their advance until rescue assets could arrive. Havoc is now in concealment, and enemy forces have withdrawn to covered positions. There was a pause, and Maya could imagine the conversation happening in the Air Operations Center. Her actions were defensible under rules of engagement that allowed for protection of downed personnel, but barely. She'd made a judgment call that could be career-ending or commendable depending on the final outcome. Copy, Cypher. Remain on station and coordinate with rescue assets inbound your position. We'll discuss your engagement decisions after recovery." 20 minutes later, the rescue helicopter arrived with escort aircraft. Maya vectored them toward Havoc's position, maintaining overwatch as combat rescue personnel fast-roped down and secured the area. She watched through her targeting pod as they loaded Havoc into the helicopter, watched the aircraft lift off and head toward friendly territory, watched the enemy vehicles remain in their covered positions. Only then did she turn toward the tanker to refuel for her own recovery. The debrief aboard the carrier was intense. Maya sat across from her squadron commander and the air wing commander, both of whom wanted detailed explanations of her decisions. She walked them through the tactical assessment, the threat evaluation, the calculated use of minimum force to achieve the objective. "You could have started a larger engagement," the air wing commander pointed out. "Those vehicles might have been equipped with anti-aircraft weapons. You put yourself at significant risk based on a judgment call about their intentions." "Yes, sir," Maya acknowledged. "I assessed that risk as acceptable given the alternative of allowing them to reach Havoc's position unopposed." "And if they'd shot you down?" the squadron commander asked. "Then rescue would have had 2 pilots to recover instead of 1, Maya said. "But the probability of them engaging seemed lower than the probability of them capturing Havoc if I didn't intervene." The commanders exchanged glances. After a long moment, the air wing commander leaned back in his chair. "Your actions were aggressive and pushed the boundaries of authorized engagement. They were also probably the only reason Havoc made it to rescue without being captured." He paused. "I'm not sure whether to commend you or reprimand you. Maybe both." "Commander Voss's training," Maya's squadron commander said, realization dawning. "The ground survival course. You were applying those lessons to the tactical situation." Maya nodded. "Voss taught us how quickly things deteriorate after ejection. Every minute matters. Havoc was moving when he should have been hiding, following terrain that made him visible, making the same mistakes that got Captain Torres killed. I couldn't stop him directly, but I could buy him time by keeping the enemy at distance." The air wing commander pulled up a tactical replay of the engagement. "Havoc says you transmitted instructions to go to ground. He heard them, found a cave system, and stayed hidden until rescue arrived. Says your training made the difference between trying to evade on foot and making the smart choice to disappear." He looked at Maya directly. "The rescue team found evidence that enemy forces passed within 50 meters of his position twice before extraction. If he'd kept moving like he was initially, they would have caught him." The squadron commander shook his head slowly. "So we've got 1 pilot who applied ground survival training to save her wingman's life, using tactics that weren't exactly by the book, but were exactly what the situation required." He looked at the air wing commander. "What's the call, sir?" "The call is that Lieutenant Reeves demonstrated exceptional tactical judgment under dynamic circumstances," the air wing commander said formally. "Her actions will be noted in the mission report with commendation for initiative and courage in protecting a downed pilot. They will also be noted as exceeding standard engagement parameters, which is something we'll need to address in updated guidance." He stood, signaling the end of the debrief. "Good work, Cypher. Unorthodox, aggressive, and completely appropriate for the situation. Havoc's alive because you remembered your training and applied it when it mattered. That's what naval aviation is supposed to be about." After they dismissed her, Maya walked to the flight deck. The Mediterranean stretched in all directions, the carrier cutting through calm seas. She thought about Voss, about Torres, about how a training program built from 1 person's survival and another person's death had just saved a 3rd pilot's life. Her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Voss. Somehow the commander had already heard about the rescue, heard about Havoc. "You applied the training exactly right. Not just for yourself, but for him. Torres would be proud. So am I." The deployment continued with the intensity that had become normal for carrier operations in contested regions. Maya flew missions almost daily, strike packages against enemy infrastructure, close air support for ground forces, combat air patrol establishing air superiority. Each mission carried the possibility of catastrophic failure, of systems malfunctioning or enemy fire connecting. But now Maya flew with a different awareness. She wasn't invulnerable in her FA-18. The aircraft was capability wrapped around fragility, protection that could become a coffin in milliseconds if circumstances aligned against her. She found herself having conversations with other pilots about Voss's training, about the mindset shift it required. Some were receptive, asking questions about evasion tactics and survival priorities. Others remained skeptical, still convinced that their aircraft and the rescue apparatus behind them made ground survival training somewhat theoretical. Maya didn't push. She just remembered that she'd been skeptical too, sitting in that first briefing, judging the commander who stood at the podium with no squadron patches and a small silver pin nobody recognized. 3 weeks into deployment, the squadron received word that Commander Voss was being promoted to captain and would take command of a new training center dedicated to pilot survival and rescue coordination. The center would formalize the program she developed, making it mandatory for all naval aviators before their first combat deployment. Maya submitted a letter for Voss's promotion board. In it, she described the training not just as skill development, but as a fundamental reframing of how pilots understood their role. Commander Voss taught us that our commitment doesn't end when we eject, Maya wrote. It begins again in a different form. She gave us tools to survive, but more importantly, she gave us the mindset to apply those tools under the worst circumstances we could face. That gift is measured in lives saved and families who don't receive the worst news possible. The letter was one of dozens submitted by pilots who'd gone through Voss's training. Together they painted a picture of someone who'd taken personal tragedy and institutional failure and transformed both into systematic improvement that would protect pilots for decades to come. On a night flight 2 months into deployment, Maya's aircraft experienced a catastrophic electrical failure. Systems shut down in cascade navigation, communication, weapons, flight controls transitioning to degraded backup modes. She was 40 nautical miles from the carrier, over open ocean, in darkness with minimal ability to control the aircraft. Her training took over immediately. Emergency procedures executed from memory, prioritization of critical systems, assessment of remaining capability. She managed to restore partial electrical power, enough to limp back toward the carrier with marginal flight controls and no radar or communication. The approach to the carrier was the most challenging flying Maya had ever attempted. Degraded flight controls meant limited ability to correct for wind or deck movement. No communication meant the landing signals officer couldn't provide guidance. She was flying on instruments that were only partially functional, trying to land on a moving platform at night, with an aircraft that barely responded to control inputs. She trapped on the third wire, the aircraft slamming onto the deck with force that compressed her spine and rattled her teeth. The immediate relief of successful landing was replaced by recognition of how close she'd come to ejecting over the Mediterranean. If one more system had failed, if the electrical restoration hadn't worked, she would have been in the water at night, waiting for rescue. The incident prompted a safety review that revealed the electrical failure was due to a manufacturing defect in a component batch. 6 other aircraft in the air wing had the same vulnerable components. If Maya's failure had occurred during combat operations over land, ejection would have been likely. Ground survival training would have transitioned from theoretical to critical. The squadron commander used the incident as a teaching point during the next all-pilots meeting. Lieutenant Reeves's emergency was controlled and resolved because she executed procedures correctly and maintained aircraft control under degraded conditions, he said. But it easily could have resulted in ejection. Everyone in this room needs to remember that the gap between routine operations and life-threatening emergency is measured in component failures in seconds. Commander Voss's training exists because that gap is real and the consequences are severe. Maya noticed several pilots nodding, the skepticism from earlier in deployment replaced by recognition. They'd all seen Havoc's rescue, had all heard about Maya's near-emergency, had all been flying missions where enemy fire or mechanical failure could force ejection at any moment. The theoretical had become uncomfortably concrete. Later that week, Maya received another message from Voss. Heard about your electrical emergency. Good flying bringing it aboard. Also heard you're being considered for TOPGUN. Your tactical performance and ability to teach others makes you a strong candidate. Let me know if you want to discuss it. TOPGUN was the U.S. Navy Strike Fighter Tactics Instructor Program Elite Training that produced the service's most advanced pilots and tactical instructors. Selection was competitive, demanding, and career-defining. Maya hadn't seriously considered it before, always assuming there were pilots with more flight hours or combat experience who'd be selected first. But Voss's message made her think about what she could offer. Not just flying skill, but integrated tactical thinking that included worst-case survival scenarios. The training Voss had provided wasn't separate from air combat. It was the full spectrum of what naval aviation required. Maya submitted her TOPGUN application with endorsements from her squadron commander and the Air Wing commander. The selection board would evaluate hundreds of applicants for a handful of spots. She didn't expect selection, but the process of assembling her application forced her to articulate what she'd learned in the previous year about flying, about survival, about the integration of technical skill with tactical judgment. 3 months later, back at Naval Air Station Oshina after deployment concluded, Maya received notification of TOPGUN selection. She'd attend the next class beginning in 6 months. The notification included a note from the selection board chair. Your demonstrated tactical flexibility and ability to apply cross-domain training to complex scenarios distinguishes you from other candidates. We expect you to bring that perspective to TOPGUN and share it with the next generation of naval aviators. Maya called Voss that evening. The former commander, now Captain Voss, answered on the second ring. Congratulations, Cypher. I heard about your selection before you did. The board was impressed with your deployment performance and the incident with Havoc's rescue. Your training made the difference, Maya said. Not just for survival, but for how I think about the complete mission cycle. From launch to recovery, including the scenarios we hope never happen. That's exactly what I was hoping to achieve, Voss replied. Too many pilots compartmentalize their one person in the cockpit and would have to become someone completely different if they ejected. You've integrated those aspects. That makes you more capable both ways. They talked for an hour, discussing the training center Voss was building, the evolution of survival doctrine, and the ongoing challenge of preparing pilots for worst-case scenarios while maintaining the aggressive mindset air combat required. There's something I want you to consider, Voss said near the end of the conversation. Once you complete TOPGUN, come work for me at the Survival Training Center. We need instructors who have been through the program, who can speak from experience about integrating air and ground tactics. Your perspective would be valuable. Maya felt the weight of that invitation. TOPGUN was a career accelerator, a path toward squadron command and senior leadership. Working at a survival training center was important but less traditional, potentially limiting advancement opportunities. But she thought about tours, about Havoc, about all the pilots who'd benefit from training that could save their lives. Let me get through TOPGUN first, Maya said. But yes, I'm interested. What you've built matters more than career progression. If I can help make it better, that's worth consideration. Fair enough, Voss acknowledged. Focus on TOPGUN. We'll talk about the future when you're ready. TOPGUN proved to be everything Maya had heard and more. The program pushed her flying to levels she hadn't imagined possible, refining tactical skills and teaching her to think about air combat at a systemic level. But she also noticed gaps in the curriculum, specifically around post-ejection scenarios and pilot survival. During one class discussion about surface-to-air missile evasion, Maya raised a question the instructor hadn't anticipated. Sir, these maneuvers are designed to defeat the missile, but if we can't defeat it and we have to eject, what's the tactical consideration for ejection timing and location? The instructor, a seasoned combat pilot, paused. You eject when the aircraft becomes unflyable and you do it away from populated areas if possible. Beyond that, survival is a separate skill set. But it's not separate, Maya pressed. If I'm evading a missile at low altitude over enemy territory, my ejection timing determines whether I land in a location that's defensible or completely exposed. That's a tactical decision that should be part of the evasion calculus, not an afterthought. The class discussion evolved into a deeper examination of how air combat tactics interfaced with survival scenarios. Several TOPGUN instructors became involved, and by the end, they'd identified what they called the ejection decision matrix, factors pilots should consider when deciding not just if to eject but when and where, based on terrain, enemy positions, and rescue probability. Maya worked with two instructors to formalize the concept into a brief she delivered to the entire TOPGUN cadre. It drew directly from Voss's training, integrating survival priorities into tactical decision-making. The response was mixed. Some instructors saw immediate value, others felt it diluted focus on air combat primacy. But the commandant of TOPGUN attended the brief and afterward pulled Maya aside. "You're thinking about the full mission in ways we haven't traditionally emphasized," he said. "TOPGUN focuses on air superiority and strike tactics. What you're proposing is integration across mission phases, including failure scenarios. That's valuable, but it's also somewhat revolutionary for how we approach training. Sir, Captain Voss taught me that survival isn't a separate skill. It's the continuation of tactical thinking in a different domain. If we're training pilots to be the most capable in air combat, shouldn't we also prepare them to be most capable if that combat goes badly?" The commandant nodded slowly. "Write it up formally. I want to see a proposal for how we'd integrate this into TOPGUN curriculum without diluting our primary focus. If you can make the case that it enhances rather than distracts from air combat capability, we'll consider implementation." Maya spent the next 6 weeks developing what became known as the Continuous Mission Model, a framework arguing that pilot effectiveness couldn't be measured solely by cockpit performance, but had to include the complete mission cycle from brief to debrief, including contingency scenarios like ejection, survival, and rescue. The model drew from Voss's training, her own deployment experience, case studies of pilot losses, and tactical analysis showing how survival capability affected pilot decision-making during high-risk missions. The proposal argued that pilots who understood survival tactics flew differently, more strategically about positioning, more aware of terrain features, more likely to maintain situational awareness that served dual purposes. The TOPGUN leadership reviewed the proposal with what Maya could only describe as intense scrutiny. They brought in experts from search and rescue, reviewed combat loss data, and conducted their own analysis of whether survival training enhanced or detracted from air combat focus. 3 months after Maya submitted the proposal, TOPGUN announced a pilot program. 2 hours of survival and evasion training would be integrated into each TOPGUN class, taught by instructors certified in both air combat and ground survival tactics. The training would emphasize decision-making continuity, how tactical thinking in the cockpit translated to tactical thinking on the ground. Maya was asked to be one of the instructors for the pilot program. She agreed immediately, understanding this was the intersection of everything she'd learned. She would teach air combat tactics she'd mastered through TOPGUN, while integrating survival principles Voss had drilled into her during that transformative 3-week course. The first class she taught included 12 pilots, all of them skeptical in ways Maya recognized from her own initial reaction to Voss's training. They were the best of the best, people who'd been selected for TOPGUN based on exceptional performance. The idea that they needed survival training seemed to imply weakness in their primary skill set. Maya started the class exactly as Voss had started hers, with a photograph and a story. But instead of tours, she showed a picture of Havoc, the pilot she'd helped protect during her deployment. "This is Lieutenant Commander Marcus Hayes, Call sign Havoc, Maya began. Shot down over Syria during my last deployment. He ejected successfully, landed in hostile territory, and was recovered by combat search and rescue 97 minutes later. He's alive today for 3 reasons. First, he had training that prepared him for ground survival. Second, his wingman employed aggressive tactics to delay enemy forces. Third, he made correct decisions under pressure when every instinct told him to move instead of hide. She advanced to the next slide, showing the terrain where Havoc had landed. If he hadn't had survival training, he would have followed this dry riverbed toward friendly lines. Enemy forces would have captured him within 40 minutes based on their response time and movement patterns. Instead, he went aground in this cave system and waited for rescue. Maya looked at the assembled pilots. I'm going to teach you how to think about your mission from brief to landing, including the scenarios where landing means parachute instead of runway. This isn't about making you survival experts. It's about extending your tactical thinking into domains you hope never to experience but need to be prepared for. Over the next 2 hours, Maya walked the pilots through integrated tactical scenarios, air combat situations that required ejection decisions, survival priorities that affected where and when to eject, evasion tactics that built on air combat situational awareness. She showed them how the same pattern recognition they used to defeat air threats applied to evading ground pursuit, how the same risk assessment they used for weapons employment applied to survival resource management. The pilots began asking questions that showed they were thinking about the integration rather than viewing survival as separate from air combat. A lieutenant asked about ejection timing when engaged by multiple threats. Should you prioritize surviving the immediate engagement or positioning yourself for better survival prospects? It was exactly the kind of integrated thinking Maya wanted to encourage. There's no simple answer, Maya said. It's context-dependent tactical decision-making, which is what you're already trained to do. The difference is expanding your decision matrix to include post-ejection scenarios as variables rather than afterthoughts. By the end of the class, she could see the mental shift happening. These weren't pilots being lectured on survival basics. They were tactical thinkers being given additional tools for comprehensive mission planning. The evaluation forms reflected that understanding. Comments mentioned eye-opening integration, tactical continuity, and should be permanent curriculum. TOPGUN leadership reviewed the pilot program results and made it permanent. 2 hours of survival-integrated tactical training became standard for all TOPGUN classes. Maya was asked to train additional instructors and develop advanced modules that could be offered as electives. She called Voss with the news. We've made it permanent. Survival training is now part of TOPGUN curriculum, taught as integrated tactical thinking rather than separate skill set. Your methodology is being adopted at the highest level of naval aviation training. Voss's response carried genuine emotion. That's more than I hoped for when I started pushing this program. TOPGUN setting the standard means every naval aviator will eventually see this as normal rather than exceptional. That's institutional change that will save lives for decades. I want to take you up on your offer, Maya said. After I complete my TOPGUN instructor tour, I want to come work at your training center. Not instead of continuing as a pilot, but as part of developing the next evolution of integrated training. We've proven the concept at TOPGUN. Now we need to scale it across the entire community. I was hoping you'd say that, Voss replied. We're building something important here. Having someone with your credibility and experience would accelerate what we're trying to achieve. 3 years after that first briefing where Maya had sat skeptically in the back row, she found herself standing at a podium in front of 200 naval aviators at a conference on combat readiness. She was there to present the integrated survival model that had evolved from Voss's initial training program through TOPGUN implementation, and now into fleet-wide consideration. The presentation covered everything she'd learned: tactical case studies, survival statistics, training methodologies, and the philosophical shift from viewing survival as separate from combat to understanding it as mission continuity under worst-case circumstances. She showed data demonstrating that pilots who'd completed integrated training made better tactical decisions even when survival scenarios didn't occur, because they had more comprehensive situational awareness and risk assessment capabilities. Near the end of the presentation, Maya displayed a photograph she'd requested from Voss's personal collection. It showed two pilots in flight gear, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling at the camera. This is Captain Patricia Voss and Captain Michael Torres, taken 6 months before the mission where Voss was shot down, and Torres stayed on station to protect her, Maya said to the silent auditorium. Torres died 4 months ago in a separate incident, shot down over Syria, killed after ejection because he lacked the survival training that might have kept him alive long enough for rescue. She paused, letting that sink in. Captain Voss could have taken Torres' death as tragedy and moved on. Instead, she built a training program that has now been completed by over 1,500 naval aviators. That program has been credited with saving 4 lives definitively and probably contributing to dozens of other successful survivals. The training you've seen presented today exists because one person decided that her wingman's death had to mean something. Maya advanced to the final slide, showing the Survival Training Center Voss now commanded, showing TOPGUN students working through integrated scenarios, showing rescue footage of pilots who'd successfully evaded using techniques they'd learned. We can't eliminate the risk of being shot down. We can't guarantee rescue will always succeed. But we can prepare our pilots comprehensively for every phase of their mission, including the phases we hope they never experience. That's what integrated training achieves. That's what Captain Voss started, and what we're now implementing across naval aviation. The standing ovation that followed wasn't for Maya. It was for Voss, for Torres, for every pilot who'd contributed to evolving how the Navy prepared its people for comprehensive combat operations. After the conference, Maya received orders to the Survival Training Center as Deputy Commander for Curriculum Development. She would work directly with Voss to expand integrated training programs, develop new scenarios based on emerging threats, and ensure that lessons learned from every incident fed back into continuous improvement of training methodology. On her first day at the training center, Voss met her at the entrance with a smile that carried deep satisfaction. "Welcome aboard, Cypher. Ready to change how we prepare pilots for the worst day of their lives." "More than ready," Maya replied. "Ready to make sure that worst day doesn't become their last day." They walked through the facility together, Voss showing Maya the evolution since that first 3-week program. There were now permanent buildings for classroom training, extensive field exercise areas with varied terrain, realistic opposition force training, and integration with rescue units for comprehensive scenario development. "This is what institutional change looks like," Voss said as they observed a class working through night evasion training. It started with anger about losing Torres, evolved into a training concept, survived skepticism and bureaucratic resistance, proved value through successful applications, and now it's becoming the standard. That's the arc of meaningful innovation in military culture. Maya watched the students moving through darkness, applying techniques she'd learned in the same program years ago. What's next? Where does the training evolve from here? Voss pulled out a planning document she'd been developing. Next is integration with allied forces, ensuring NATO pilots have similar capabilities. Then expansion into other domains. How do space operators survive if systems fail? What about cyber warfare personnel operating in hostile countries? The principles we've developed for aviators apply more broadly. She looked at Maya directly. That's where you come in. You've got credibility from TOPGUN, operational experience from deployment, and teaching capability from instructor tour. You can sell this program to communities that might otherwise dismiss it as not relevant to their mission. That's how we achieve the next level of institutional adoption. The work was challenging and deeply satisfying. Maya spent her days developing curriculum, evaluating training effectiveness, integrating lessons from recent combat operations, and teaching classes that ranged from basic survival skills to advanced tactical integration. She saw pilots arrive skeptical and leave convinced, watched them apply training during subsequent deployments, received reports of successful survivals that could be traced directly to techniques they'd learned. 2 years into her assignment at the training center, Maya received news that Commander Hayes Havoc, the pilot whose rescue had started her thinking about integrated training, was taking command of a strike fighter squadron. He called her personally to share the news. "I wanted you to know that survival training is now mandatory for my squadron before we deploy. Not because Navy policy requires it, but because I require it. Every pilot under my command will complete your program before we go into harm's way." "That's the goal," Maya told him. "Squadron commanders who have experienced the value of training making it non-negotiable for their people. That's how cultural change becomes permanent." "You saved my life by applying what Voss taught you," Havoc said quietly. "Now I get to potentially save other lives by ensuring they have the same preparation. That's a chain of impact worth being part of." The conversation ended, but Maya sat thinking about chains of impact. Tors died, which motivated Voss to create training. Voss's training prepared Maya, who applied it to save Havoc. Havoc now commanded a squadron that would train comprehensively, potentially saving future pilots who would create their own chains of impact. Military culture changed not through top-down mandates alone, but through networks of people who'd experienced something valuable and chose to propagate it. That evening, Maya wrote an evaluation of training effectiveness that would be reviewed by senior Navy leadership. In it, she documented not just statistics and survival rates, but the qualitative shift she'd observed in how pilots approached their profession when they understood the full spectrum of tactical requirements. "Integrated survival training doesn't make pilots more cautious," she wrote. "It makes them more capable. They fly with comprehensive awareness that enhances mission effectiveness while preparing them for contingencies. This isn't about fear, it's about competence across all mission phases." The data shows trained pilots complete high-risk missions more successfully because they assess risk more completely and make decisions with better information. The evaluation was briefed to the Chief of Naval Operations 3 months later. Maya wasn't present for that brief, but Voss called her afterward with news. "CNO has directed that integrated survival training become mandatory for all naval aviators before first combat deployment. It's not optional, it's not recommended, it's required. Your evaluation and the supporting data convinced him this was mission essential rather than supplemental." Maya felt the weight of that decision. Thousands of pilots would now complete training that might save their lives. More importantly, the Navy's institutional culture had shifted to recognize that comprehensive preparation across all mission phases was fundamental to combat effectiveness. "We should tell Tor's family," Maya said. "They should know that his death led to institutional change that will protect future pilots. That's not consolation for their loss, but it means his service mattered beyond his last mission." Voss was quiet for a moment. "I've stayed in touch with his family. I'll tell them. And I'll make sure they understand that the chain of impact includes you, includes Havoc, includes every pilot who's been trained and every life that's been saved as a result." 5 years after sitting in that first briefing, Maya stood again in front of a class of pilots beginning their survival training. But this time, the class included international participants, pilots from Allied air forces who'd heard about the Navy's integrated program and requested access to the training. Maya began with the photograph and the story, exactly as Voss had done for her. "This is Captain Michael Tors. Shot down over Syria, killed after ejection because he lacked the training you're about to receive. His death led to the creation of this program. His legacy is measured in lives saved because people learned lessons his experience taught us." She looked at the assembled pilots, Americans, British, French, German, Japanese, all of them sitting with the same mixture of skepticism and professional attention she'd brought to her first class. "I'm going to teach you how to survive when your aircraft can't protect you anymore. Some of you will never need this training. I hope that's true for all of you. But statistically, Some of you will eject in hostile territory at some point in your careers. When that happens, this training will be the difference between survival and capture, between making it home and becoming a casualty statistic. The class proceeded through 3 weeks of intensive training classroom work, field exercises, realistic opposition force scenarios, resistance training, and integrated tactical decision-making. Maya watched the transformation happen the same way it had happened for her, the same way Voss had seen it happen for hundreds of pilots. The skepticism gave way to recognition. The resistance to vulnerability shifted into preparation for worst-case scenarios. The separation between air combat and ground survival collapsed into integrated tactical thinking. On the final day, after the last students completed their extraction and the course concluded, one of the British pilots approached Maya. "Ma'am, that training changed how I think about my profession. I've been flying fast jets for 8 years. I've done combat deployments. I thought I was prepared for anything. But I wasn't prepared for the scenario where my aircraft fails and I'm alone on the ground. Now I am. That's a gift I didn't know I needed." Maya nodded, remembering having almost identical thoughts after her own training. Pass it forward. When you're in a position to influence training or policy, make sure other pilots get this preparation. That's how the impact multiplies beyond individual survival. Later that week, Maya received a message from the Chief of Naval Operations' office. She was being considered for command of a strike fighter squadron returning to operational flying, while maintaining connection to the training programs she'd helped develop. The message noted that her comprehensive tactical background, teaching experience, and operational credibility made her an ideal candidate for shaping how squadrons integrated survival preparation into deployment workups. Maya called Voss with the news. "They want me back in a squadron. Command tour, which means responsibility for preparing pilots for combat deployment." "You should do it," Voss said immediately. "The training center will continue with the foundation we've built, but having someone with your perspective in squadron command means integrated training becomes operational reality rather than schoolhouse theory. You'll implement at the unit level what we've been teaching at the institutional level." "I'm torn," Maya admitted. "The training center feels like unfinished work. There's so much more we could develop and refine." "The work is never finished," Voss replied. "That's the nature of continuous improvement, but you've built something here that will outlast both of us. Now you need to prove it works in the operational environment where it matters most. Take the squadron, lead from that position. Show that integrated tactical thinking produces better combat outcomes. That's the next phase of your impact." 6 months later, Maya took command of Strike Fighter Squadron 147, the Argonauts, aboard Naval Air Station Lemoore. Her change of command speech focused on comprehensive combat readiness, not just flying proficiency and tactical competence, but preparation across all mission phases, including scenarios the squadron hoped never to experience. "We're going to train harder than any squadron in the air wing," Maya told her assembled pilots and sailors. "Not just in the air, but on the ground. Not just in tactics we hope to employ, but in contingencies we hope to avoid. We're going to deploy as the most comprehensively prepared unit in naval aviation, capable of succeeding in our primary mission while surviving the worst-case alternatives." The first thing Maya implemented was mandatory survival training for the entire squadron. Every pilot, regardless of experience level, completed the 3-week integrated program. Senior officers who'd been flying for 15 years trained alongside junior officers on their first fleet assignment. The message was clear: comprehensive preparation wasn't optional or rank-dependent. During squadron workups before deployment, Maya integrated survival scenarios into every major exercise. Pilots briefed not just air combat tactics, but also ejection decision matrices, evasion routes, rescue coordination procedures. The maintenance department ensured survival equipment received the same priority as weapons systems. The operations department developed contingency plans for multiple simultaneous rescue scenarios. Other squadron commanders noticed the emphasis. Some were supportive, having seen the value of integrated training. Others were skeptical, suggesting Maya was distorting priorities away from air combat proficiency toward unlikely contingencies. The debate played out in wardroom discussions and air wing meetings, forcing Maya to continuously articulate why comprehensive preparation enhanced rather than detracted from primary mission capabilities. The test came 7 months into her command, during a high-intensity training exercise off the coast of California. One of Maya's pilots, a lieutenant junior grade named Chen, experienced complete hydraulic failure during an air combat maneuvering exercise. The aircraft became uncontrollable. Chen had seconds to decide whether to attempt an emergency landing or eject over mountainous terrain. He ejected, choosing a location that balanced immediate safety with survival considerations. The parachute deployed successfully. Chen landed in rugged mountain terrain 40 miles from the nearest road, in an area where rescue would require several hours to coordinate and execute. But instead of panicking or making immediate movement toward civilization, he applied the integrated training Maya had insisted on. Chen established a hide site, assessed his situation, checked survival equipment, and waited for rescue coordination. He used his survival radio to communicate position and status, but didn't attempt movement through terrain he wasn't prepared to navigate. The rescue helicopter reached him 4 hours after ejection. When they extracted him, the rescue swimmers found Chen in a carefully concealed position, hydrated, mentally composed, and ready for pickup. The rescue coordination team later called it a textbook survival scenario. Pilot made correct ejection decision, landed safely, applied survival protocols, and facilitated his own rescue through proper procedures. Maya visited Chen in medical after his evaluation was complete. "You did everything right," she told him. "From ejection decision through survival protocols to rescue coordination. That's exactly what integrated training is designed to produce." Chen looked exhausted but satisfied. "Skipper, I kept hearing your voice in my head during those 4 hours. All the training scenarios we ran, all the briefs about patience and proper procedures. It worked exactly like you said it would. I wanted to start walking toward the road. Every instinct said move, get away from the ejection site, head toward civilization. But I remembered the training stay concealed, conserve energy, wait for rescue. It was hard, but it was right." The incident became a training case study. Maya had Chen brief the squadron on his decision-making process, from the moment he recognized hydraulic failure through his thought process during ejection, landing, and survival. The brief was detailed and honest, including the psychological challenge of waiting instead of moving. "I thought I understood survival training," Chen told the assembled squadron. "I'd completed the course, passed all the exercises, but experiencing it for real was completely different. The fear is visceral. The urge to do something, anything, is overwhelming. If I hadn't had training so deeply ingrained that it became automatic, I would have made mistakes. Probably wouldn't have been fatal mistakes given that this was a training exercise in California, not combat in hostile territory. But the pattern would have been established. I would have learned to trust panic instead of training." Maya watched her pilots absorb that message. This wasn't theoretical anymore. This was their peer, someone they flew with daily, describing how training had worked under real pressure. The skepticism that some had maintained evaporated in the face of Chen's lived experience. Word of the incident and Maya's squadron training emphasis spread through naval aviation. When the Argonauts deployed 8 months later, they were considered one of the best prepared squadrons in recent memory, not just for their primary air combat mission, but for the full spectrum of scenarios they might encounter. The deployment itself was intense but successful. Maya's squadron flew hundreds of combat missions supporting operations across the Middle East. They employed weapons with precision, maintained aircraft availability rates above air wing average, and demonstrated tactical proficiency that earned recognition from the strike group commander. But more importantly to Maya, they completed the deployment without losing a single pilot. There were close calls, aircraft damaged by enemy fire, systems failures that could have been catastrophic, tactical situations that pushed pilots to their limits. But the combination of flying skill, tactical judgment, and comprehensive preparation meant every pilot who launched returned safely. Near the end of deployment, Maya received a message that Captain Voss was retiring from the Navy. The career that had included combat operations, survival and evasion, development of transformative training programs, and institutional change was coming to a close. Maya requested and received permission to record a video message for Voss's retirement ceremony. In it, she stood on the carrier flight deck with FA-18s launching behind her. "Captain Voss, what you started with survival training has become bigger than either of us imagined. It's now standard across naval aviation. It's being adopted by allied forces. It's changing how we prepare pilots for comprehensive combat operations. But more than the institutional impact, you've created a chain of people who understand that our commitment to each other extends from brief to debrief, including the scenarios we hope never happen." She paused as an aircraft trapped on the deck behind her, the controlled crash of arrested landing perfectly illustrating the violent beauty of naval aviation. "I'm standing here as a squadron commander who's brought every single pilot home safely from combat deployment. Some of that is skill. Some is luck, but a significant portion is the culture of comprehensive preparation you taught me to value. That culture is your legacy, and it will protect pilots long after both of us are gone. Thank you for turning tragedy into transformation, for demanding that we be better than comfortable, and for showing us that true tactical excellence includes preparation for our worst moments, not just our best ones." The retirement ceremony took place at Naval Air Station Oshina, the same location where Voss had first briefed Maya and dozens of other skeptical pilots years earlier. The hangar was filled with hundreds of people whose lives and careers had been touched by Voss's work: pilots who'd completed her training, rescue personnel who'd recovered pilots trained in her methods, squadron commanders who'd implemented her programs, senior leaders who'd supported institutional change. The ceremony included the traditional elements: presentation of awards, recognition of service, formal remarks from senior officers. But the most powerful moment came when Voss herself took the podium for final remarks. She stood silent for a moment, looking out at the assembled crowd. Then she began speaking without notes or prepared text. "I started teaching survival training because my wingman died in a way that was preventable," Voss said quietly. "Captain Michael Torres ejected in hostile territory and didn't survive long enough for rescue to reach him. That failure, my failure to ensure he had the training he needed, became the motivation for everything that followed." She gestured toward the crowd. "Many of you went through the first iterations of that training. You were skeptical. You thought it was unnecessary or redundant. Some of you openly questioned whether a Navy commander who hadn't flown in years had anything to teach you about survival. That skepticism was fair. I had to prove the value through results, not just assertions." Voss pulled out a small notebook, worn and filled with handwritten notes. "I've kept track of every pilot who's successfully survived and evaded after ejection following completion of integrated training. The list has 93 names. 93 people who went through situations similar to what Torres faced, but who made it home because they had preparation he didn't have." She looked up from the notebook, and Maya could see the emotion she was carefully controlling. "That's 93 families who didn't receive the worst news possible, 93 careers that continued, 93 people who have gone on to teach others, to lead units, to contribute to the mission beyond a single tragic incident. That's the measure of impact that matters." Voss continued, talking about the institutional journey from rejected proposal to mandatory training, about the allies who'd supported the work against bureaucratic resistance, about the pilots like Maya who'd taken the training and expanded it into domains Voss had never imagined. "I'm retiring today, but this work isn't ending," Voss concluded. "It's being carried forward by people in this room, and people they'll teach, and people those students will eventually lead. That's how military culture evolves, through chains of impact that extend beyond any individual career or contribution. I started this because of Torres. It continued because of all of you, and it will endure because you'll demand it for the next generation. As the ceremony concluded and people began moving toward the reception, Maya approached Voss. They'd worked together for years, but this felt like a significant transition. The mentor who'd changed Maya's entire understanding of her profession was stepping away from the institution that had defined her life. "I have something for you," Maya said, pulling out a small package. Voss opened it to reveal a photograph in a frame. It showed Maya standing in front of her squadron, the Argonauts, on the carrier deck at the end of their deployment. Written across the bottom were signatures, every pilot in the squadron, each one adding a brief note of thanks. "We all completed deployment safely," Maya said. "Every single pilot who deployed with me came home. Some of that is luck, but a lot of it is culture you created, training you developed, and standards you set. This is from all of us recognition that your work saved lives in ways we can measure and probably in ways we'll never know about." Voss studied the photograph silently, reading the notes, seeing the faces of pilots she'd never met but who'd been shaped by training she'd created. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with tears she didn't bother hiding. "This is what it was all for," she said quietly. "Not the awards or the recognition, but this. Real people, safe outcomes, mission success combined with comprehensive protection. Thank you for showing me that what started as personal mission became institutional transformation." They stood together in comfortable silence, two women who'd been shaped by military aviation in different eras, but connected by commitment to ensuring others survived their worst moments. Around them, the reception continued, people celebrating a career, sharing stories, maintaining the social bonds that held military culture together. But in that moment, Maya and Voss both understood they were part of something larger than individual achievement. They were links in a chain that extended from Tor's death through Voss's response, through Maya's application and expansion, through thousands of pilots who'd been trained and dozens who'd survived because of that training. "What's next for you?" Maya asked. "Civilian life, family time, maybe teaching at a university." Voss smiled slightly. "I've been asked to consult with Allied air forces on survival training programs. Apparently word has spread internationally about what we've built. Several countries want to implement similar integrated programs. I might do that part-time, help them avoid the mistakes we made in early iterations, share lessons learned." She looked at Maya directly. "But mostly, I want to watch what you and others do with this foundation. The next evolution doesn't need me. It needs people like you who can operate at the intersection of tactical excellence and comprehensive preparation. That's where the future of military aviation is heading, full-spectrum capability across all mission phases." Maya remained in Squadron Command for 2 years after Voss's retirement. During that time, she deployed the Argonauts once more, maintained the culture of integrated training she'd established, and continued developing the model of leadership that valued comprehensive preparation as much as tactical proficiency. Every pilot who served under her command completed survival training. Every major exercise included contingency scenarios. Every mission brief addressed not just primary objectives, but also worst-case alternatives and recovery procedures. The approach produced measurable results: higher mission success rates, better risk assessment, and continued perfect safety record despite flying some of the most dangerous missions naval aviation conducted. After her squadron command tour, Maya was selected for the National War College, the senior leadership development program that prepared officers for strategic-level responsibilities. The selection was competitive and career-defining, recognizing her not just as an exceptional pilot, but as someone capable of shaping institutional direction at the highest levels. At the War College, Maya wrote her thesis on integrated training models and their impact on operational effectiveness. She argued that military culture had traditionally separated specialist training into domains. Pilots learned flying, ground troops learned ground combat, sailors learned ship operations. But modern warfare required integration across domains, and training needed to reflect that reality. The pilot who understands ground survival isn't just better prepared for ejection scenarios, Maya wrote. She's a better pilot because she understands terrain differently, assesses risk more comprehensively, and makes tactical decisions with awareness of multi-domain implications. Similarly, ground troops who understand air operations can better coordinate with aviation assets. Integration enhances primary capability rather than diluting it. The thesis received recognition from the War College faculty and was published in the Naval War College Review, reaching audience far beyond the immediate military aviation community. Maya began receiving invitations to speak at conferences, to consult on training programs, to advise senior leaders on how comprehensive preparation models could be applied across different warfare specialties. 3 years after leaving Squadron Command, Maya was promoted to captain and received orders as Air Wing Commander aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln. The position carried responsibility for all aviation operations from a carrier, typically 7 or 8 squadrons, hundreds of pilots and aircraft, complex mission planning across multiple warfare areas. It was the pinnacle of operational aviation leadership, the position from which she could implement at scale everything she'd learned about integrated training and comprehensive preparation. Her first act as Air Wing Commander was to mandate survival training for every pilot in the Air Wing, regardless of squadron or aircraft type. Strike fighter pilots, helicopter crews, electronic warfare officers, cargo pilots, all would complete integrated survival and evasion training before the Air Wing's next deployment. The decision wasn't universally popular. Some squadron commanders argued their pilots had different mission sets that didn't require the same survival emphasis. Helicopter pilots pointed out they operated differently than jet pilots. Electronic warfare crews suggested their mission focus was incompatible with extensive ground training. Maya addressed the concerns in an Air Wing all-officers meeting. Every person who flies from this carrier faces the possibility of catastrophic failure that puts them on the ground in hostile or contested territory, she said. The specific aircraft and mission don't change that fundamental reality. What changes is how we prepare for that scenario. She pulled up data from the last decade of aviation losses across all communities. Helicopter pilots have been shot down and captured. Electronic warfare aircraft have been hit by enemy fire. Even cargo pilots operating in supposedly permissive environments have experienced emergencies that force them down in dangerous locations. The threat is universal, even if the primary missions differ. Maya advanced to the next slide, showing survival outcomes. Pilots with integrated training survive and evade at rates 40% higher than pilots without that training. The training works regardless of aircraft type or primary mission specialty. This isn't about making everyone into ground combat experts. It's about giving everyone baseline capability to survive worst-case scenarios long enough for rescue to work. The squadron commanders couldn't argue with data. Over the next 6 months, the entire Air Wing rotated through survival training at the center Voss had built and Maya had helped develop. The training was modified for different communities. Helicopter crews learned techniques specific to their operating environments. Electronic warfare officers focused on scenarios relevant to their mission profiles. But the core integrated approach remained consistent. By the time the Lincoln deployed, the Air Wing had become what Maya called comprehensively capable, proficient in primary missions, while prepared for contingencies across multiple failure scenarios. The cultural shift was visible in how pilots approached mission planning, how they evaluated risk, and how they supported each other during high-threat operations. 4 months into deployment, that comprehensive preparation was tested. A Marine Corps helicopter operating from the Lincoln went down in mountainous terrain in Afghanistan. 4 crew members ejected successfully, but landed in an area controlled by hostile forces, separated from each other by rough terrain, facing the immediate threat of capture. The rescue operation that followed would later be studied as a model of comprehensive preparation, producing successful outcomes under worst-case circumstances. The 4 Marine crew members, 2 pilots and 2 crew chiefs, all applied integrated survival training immediately after landing. Instead of attempting to link up or move toward friendly territory, each established concealment and used survival radios to communicate position and status. The Rescue Coordination Center aboard the Lincoln, led by personnel who'd been through the same integrated training, immediately implemented procedures designed for exactly this scenario. They established communication with all 4 survivors, coordinated quick reaction forces, arranged air support, and began building a rescue plan that accounted for terrain, enemy positions, and survivor capabilities. Maya personally led the rescue coordination, making real-time decisions about asset allocation and timing. She launched additional aircraft to provide overwatch, coordinated with ground forces to establish blocking positions, and maintained communication with the survivors to ensure they understood the rescue timeline and stayed concealed. The operation took 11 hours from initial crash to final extraction. During that time, enemy forces moved through the area searching for survivors. Twice they came within meters of survivor positions. But the training held. The Marines stayed concealed, controlled their fear, and waited for rescue rather than attempting movement that would have exposed them. When the rescue helicopters finally extracted all 4 crew members, they found them tired and shaken, but uninjured and operationally capable. The rescue team leader later reported that all 4 had applied survival protocols, exactly as trained, creating conditions that made the rescue feasible despite hostile presence and difficult terrain. The successful rescue became international News Force service members recovered from hostile territory without casualties, without compromising operational security, and without escalating into larger engagement. Senior military leadership recognized it as validation of integrated training approaches and comprehensive preparation models. Maya received a personal message from the Chief of Naval Operations. The rescue operation you coordinated demonstrates the value of comprehensive training and preparation at every level. The survivors applied protocols you've championed. The rescue forces executed procedures you've helped develop. The outcome, all 4 recovered safely, is the measure of success that matters. Well done to you and your entire team. But the message that meant more to Maya came from an unexpected source. One of the rescued Marines sent her a letter 3 weeks after the incident. Captain Reeves, I'm Sergeant Marcus Williams, one of the crew chiefs rescued from Afghanistan. I wanted you to know that the survival training probably saved my life. When I hit the ground after ejection, my first instinct was to run, to put distance between myself and the crash site to find friendly forces. But I remembered the training, specifically the instructor telling us about Captain Torres and how movement got him killed. So I went aground instead, found concealment and waited. It was the hardest thing I've done, staying still when every instinct said move. But it worked. Maya read that letter multiple times, each reading reinforcing why the work mattered. Sergeant Williams was alive because training had overridden panic. His family wouldn't receive condolence notification because institutional culture had evolved to prepare people for worst-case scenarios. The chain of impact extended from Tor's death through Voss's response, through Maya's implementation, through Williams's survival. Maya completed her Air Wing Command tour with that Afghanistan rescue as a defining achievement among many operational successes. The Lincoln Air Wing flew thousands of combat missions, employed weapons with precision, and maintained safety standards that exceeded historical norms. But the rescue operation demonstrated something beyond tactical proficiency. It showed that comprehensive preparation produced better outcomes across all mission types. Her next assignment took her to the Pentagon, to a senior staff position focused on training and readiness policy across naval aviation. The position carried responsibility for shaping how the Navy prepared its aviation forces for current and future operations. Maya used that platform to institutionalize integrated training approaches that had evolved from Voss's original survival program. She developed policy requiring survival training before first deployment. She established standards for squadron-level preparation that included comprehensive contingency planning. She worked with allied forces to share training methodologies and create interoperable rescue procedures. The work was bureaucratic and often frustrating. Changing institutional culture at scale required patience, political skill, and willingness to compromise on details while protecting core principles. But Maya had learned from watching Voss that meaningful change happened incrementally, through accumulated decisions and persistent advocacy. 3 years into her Pentagon assignment, Maya was promoted to Rear Admiral flag rank that brought broader responsibility and authority to shape naval aviation at strategic levels. The promotion ceremony was attended by dozens of people who'd been part of the integrated training journey, including Captain Voss, who came out of retirement to pin on Maya's first star. "You've taken what I started and made it bigger than I imagined," Voss said during the ceremony. "Survival training was my response to personal tragedy. You've transformed it into institutional capability that spans communities, allies, and warfare domains. That's the definition of strategic impact." Maya wore her new rank with awareness of what it represented: not personal achievement, but position from which to continue advocating for comprehensive preparation and integrated training. As a flag officer, she could influence policy at the highest levels, shape budget priorities, and ensure training programs received resources necessary for sustained effectiveness. In her first major initiative as Rear Admiral, Maya established a comprehensive review of all aviation training across naval services. The review examined not just survival and evasion, but every aspect of how pilots, crew members, and support personnel were prepared for their missions. The goal was identifying gaps similar to what Voss had found years earlier: places where institutional assumptions created vulnerabilities that training could address. The review took 18 months and involved hundreds of interviews, analysis of decades of operational data, and coordination with international partners who could offer comparative perspectives. The findings were both validating and troubling. Validating because integrated survival training had demonstrably improved outcomes. Ejection survival rates had increased 43% since the training became mandatory. Troubling because the review identified other gaps where training hadn't kept pace with operational reality. The final report made 27 recommendations for training improvements across multiple domains. Some were straightforward: updating curriculum to reflect new threats, providing better equipment, increasing training frequency. Others were more fundamental: changing how different communities coordinated, breaking down barriers between specialties, creating integrated training scenarios that prepared people for multi-domain operations. Maya briefed the recommendations to the Chief of Naval Operations and the Secretary of the Navy. The brief was comprehensive, data-driven, and built on lessons learned from the survival training success. She argued that just as survival training had evolved from addressing a specific gap to creating comprehensive capability, other training improvements could produce similar outcomes if properly resourced and institutionally supported. The CNO approved 16 of the 27 recommendations immediately, providing budget authority and policy direction for implementation. The remaining 11 required additional analysis or coordination with other services, but Maya had established framework for continuing advocacy and development. Over the next 3 years, Maya oversaw implementation of training improvements across naval aviation. She traveled constantly, visiting squadrons to observe training, meeting with allied forces to share methodologies, speaking at conferences to advocate for comprehensive preparation approaches. The work was exhausting but deeply satisfying. She could see the impact in measurable outcomes. Accident rates decreased as training improved. Mission success rates increased as preparation became more comprehensive. Pilot retention improved as people recognized that institutional culture valued their complete welfare, not just their tactical performance. Most importantly, the gap between peacetime training and combat requirements narrowed as scenarios became more realistic and preparation more thorough. 5 years after her promotion to Rear Admiral, Maya received notification that she was being advanced to Vice Admiral and would take command of Naval Air Forces, the organization responsible for all naval aviation operations, training, and readiness. The position was one of the most senior in naval aviation, carrying responsibility for over 1,000 aircraft and tens of thousands of personnel. It was also the position from which she could ensure that integrated training and comprehensive preparation remained institutional priorities regardless of budget pressures or competing demands. Her change of command ceremony for naval air forces was held aboard the USS Carl Vinson, with hundreds of personnel attending in person and thousands more watching via video from squadrons and bases around the world. Maya's remarks focused on the journey from that first briefing where she'd sat skeptically listening to Commander Voss, through deployments and command tour and policy positions, to this moment of senior leadership. 15 years ago, I sat in a briefing room thinking I knew everything necessary about being a naval aviator, Maya said. I was technically proficient, tactically sound, and confident in my abilities. Then Captain Voss showed me a photograph of her wingman who died after ejection because he lacked training that could have saved his life. That photograph changed everything. She gestured toward the flight deck, where FA-18s and helicopters sat ready for operations. Today, every pilot who flies these aircraft has completed integrated survival training. Every squadron includes comprehensive preparation in their deployment workups. Every rescue coordination center uses procedures developed from lessons learned over the last decade and a half. That didn't happen by accident. It happened because people decided that protecting our personnel required more than tactical proficiency. It required preparation across all scenarios, including the ones we hope never occur. Maya looked directly at the camera transmitting to squadrons worldwide. The next 15 years will bring new challenges. New technologies, new threats, new operational environments that we can't fully predict from where we sit today. But the principle remains: constant comprehensive preparation produces better outcomes than narrow specialization. Integration across domains creates capability that specialization alone cannot achieve. An institutional culture that values complete welfare of personnel will always outperform culture that values only their tactical contribution. She concluded with words that echoed what Voss had told her years earlier. Your commitment to each other extends from brief to debrief, including scenarios we hope never happen. That's what it means to be part of naval aviation. That's the standard we maintain, and that's the culture we'll continue building together. As the ceremony concluded and Maya assumed her new responsibilities, she reflected on how far the journey had traveled from that initial 3-week survival course. What had started as one captain's response to tragic loss had become institutional capability, spanning multiple services and allied nations. The chain of impact that began with Tor's death had extended through Voss's innovation, Maya's implementation and expansion, and now through thousands of personnel who carried forward the integrated training model. That evening, Maya video called Captain Voss, now fully retired and living in Virginia. Voss answered wearing civilian clothes, looking relaxed and content in ways that military service rarely allowed. Congratulations on the new position, Admiral, Voss said with a smile. 3 stars and command of all naval aviation. That's about as far as the journey can go in operational leadership. The journey you started, Maya corrected. I'm standing on foundation you built. Every policy I implement, every training program I oversee, every improvement we make, it all traces back to you deciding that Tor's death had to mean something. Voss was quiet for a moment, and Maya could see emotion crossing her face. It's been 15 years since I started that training program. Sometimes I wonder if Tors would recognize what came from his loss. A whole generation of pilots prepared differently, hundreds of lives saved, institutional culture transformed. That's legacy beyond what any individual could hope for. He'd be proud, Maya said simply. And so should you be. The impact extends further than either of us can fully measure. Every pilot trained, every successful rescue, every career that continues because someone survived instead of dying. That's all part of what you set in motion. They talked for another hour, discussing the evolution of training programs, the challenges of maintaining institutional focus amid competing priorities, and the satisfaction of seeing transformation that outlasted individual careers. As the call ended, Maya sat in her new office looking at photographs on the wall. There was one of her squadron from her command tour, another of the air wing during her deployment as CAG, a third showing her receiving her flag rank from Voss. And centered among them all, a copy of the photograph Voss had shown in that first briefing Captain Michael Tors in flight gear, smiling at the camera, unaware that his death would catalyze changes protecting thousands of people he'd never meet. Maya understood now what Voss had been trying to teach from the beginning. Military service wasn't just about individual excellence or tactical performance. It was about creating systems and culture that protected people even in worst-case scenarios. It was about learning from